everybody. My name is Graham Brookie, and I am proud to be a partner in this election integrity partnership. I serve on a day-to-day basis as the Atlantic Council, as the director of the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. And this event is hosted by the Election Integrity Partnership, which is a coalition of top-tier research institutions that work together throughout the 2020 US elections to detect and mitigate election-related mis and disinformation. The partnership, or EIP, comprised of Stanford Internet Observatory, Graphica, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, and the DFR Lab, and served as this independent body that worked together with nearly everybody involved in election integrity on this collective challenge. And that includes election officials, state, federal, local government officials, large and small social media platforms, media, civil society organizations, and the wider research community in general. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's multi-part event, which marks the launch of the EIP's comprehensive report, The Long Fuse, Misinformation and the 2020 Election. You can find the report online at eipartnership.net or in the link right here in the chat. I also want to say thank you to those tuning in who either worked with the EIP or covered the EIP throughout this election cycle, especially those colleagues in media whose work and coverage of disinformation throughout this year was absolutely essential. So today we're going to hear from some of the managers like Kate Starbird, Camille Francois, Renee DeResta, Emerson Brookings, and researchers from the EIP on our findings and have a conversation that's facilitated by our colleague Alex Stamos. But first, we're going to hear from Chris Krebs, who is the former director of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, now more commonly known by its acronym CISA. Former Director Krebs will share insight from his time in government when one of his core responsibilities was protecting elections as critical infrastructure in democracy. And he'll also answer a few questions in a conversation led by Election Integrity Partnership Project Manager, Isabella Camargo Garcia, who made this partnership run in a major way and is a truly impressive rising star to keep an eye out for in this space. This conversation is live and on the record. Don't hesitate to drop questions into the chat or here post them on social media. And with that, over to you, Isabella.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. Wanted to kick it off just on behalf of the partnership, thanking you for your support of the EIP and all the work that you did at CISA, which was so important to our work at the partnership.
Thanks for having me, Bella, and thanks for the work you did last year. I don't know how many people know, but you are also a CISA alum. So working with you and some of your colleagues over the last year or so was one of the highlights of my experience as CISA director, just seeing the future, not just of the cybersecurity workforce, but also how disinformation and countering disinformation is such an important part of the information operations space.
Absolutely. Again, we're really excited to have you here then today to get into that. For anyone in the audience who's not as familiar with CISA or with your role at CISA, could you give us just a brief introduction and a brief introduction of your work there?
Yeah, so the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency is housed within the Department of Homeland Security. It was founded on November 16th, 2018, and I like to call it the youngest agency in the federal government. I'm pretty sure that holds up, but it is one of the younger, more nascent operations within the federal government. It's on par with the TSA, FEMA, and even the FBI in terms of its independence as an agency. I like to call them the nation's risk advisor. And what that really means more than anything is that it's not a regulatory agency. It's not really a directive agency in terms of making particularly state and locals or the private sector do much of anything. Instead, it's supposed to serve as that kind of that nexus point between public and private partners and bring everybody together to solve really hard problems, share information, and facilitate knowledge transfer. And I think that's what you saw in our work in preparation and through the 2020 election was bringing state and local partners together with the private sector, with academia, with other parts of the federal government, as well as international partners, ultimately to protect the 2020 election and defend democracy.
Absolutely. And to get to your point of CISA as the nation's risk advisor, how did you think about disinformation under this mandate, and how did you see that as part of national security vulnerabilities, especially as it relates to elections?
Well, so in January of 2017, the last secretary in the Obama administration, Jay Johnson, had designated election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, setting it up with its own critical infrastructure subsector. And so we took this on board initially with the mentality of we want to work with our state and local partners, the secretaries of state, the state election directors, the election officials at the county level, the vendors, the private sector partners that create the equipment that election officials use to facilitate elections. And initially the concept was like, oh, okay, let's improve their cybersecurity. Let's harden voter registration databases and election night reporting and the systems that are used throughout the process. But as we moved through the critical infrastructure security side of it, the cyber and physical security, and we spent 3.5 years of threat modeling around the various foreign launched intrusions that could disrupt an election, what we increasingly became aware of was that the resilience of the system, the election system itself, was pretty good. In fact, from 2016 to 2018, the election infrastructure resilience improved. So in 2015 or 16 rather, you had about 80% of votes cast were cast with a paper record associated with it. And then by the time the 2020 election came around, it was closer to 95%, and that includes the expansion in absentee and mail-in ballots. And with that, the paper ballots allowed us to do, or the state officials to do, is go back and perform recounts or audits so that they could go back and check the work. And ultimately, from where I sat, at least at CISA and with our team, that was one of the most important countering disinformation tools available to us, was the fact that there was a paper ballot that could be counted and counted and counted, like in Georgia, to disprove some of the disinfo that we saw. So ultimately, it wasn't as much about the security that we were worried about at the end. It was more the perception hacks, or somebody would claim that there was a hack going on, and sometimes it's a spaghetti against the wall approach that we had to deal with.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's so important. I think the concept you bring up of perception hacking. You brought up, paper records being associated with the vote, audits, recounts. I can be super honest here to say, before I got to CISA, a lot of this was really opaque to me, right? Even as someone who had voted in the previous election, voted in elections since 2016, these concepts make sense, right? And I've heard you say them a lot in different interviews, as we know the election was secure because of the paper trail, but that can be a little bit opaque for people. How do you think that people take that message from you, right? Being in the midst of all the potential perception hacking, and then they hear paper record. Do you think that that's enough to move people into this belief that the infrastructure is secure, the process is secure, or what do you think is missing there to bridge that gap?
So, I mean, I think the point is, above all, obviously it's not enough, that we have to do more to educate the American voters about how elections work. And that's really ultimately not a federal government responsibility. We want to be able to help facilitate that, but it happens at the state level. There has to be more education, awareness, and transparency on the various steps of an election and how technology is used. Technology is used in elections for two reasons. One is to improve access to the ballot box, but also increase efficiency and accuracy. Humans just cannot count ballots, for instance, with a high enough degree of accuracy, whereas equipment machines can. But you've got to make sure at the same time that software, that hardware is not a single point of failure. So you have to build in the various controls and in a layered defense approach, which would be familiar to anyone that's a cybersecurity professional. So I think we get there by providing additional resources. The federal government has to invest more in state elections because they can't do it themselves, and continuing eradicating and eliminating the paperless machines out there. And just to go back to that point, in 2016, Pennsylvania and Georgia did not have paper ballots associated with each vote. And the investments and the decisions that their governors made, Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, and now Governor Kemp made, even then when he was the Secretary of State, that's what gave us the confidence at the federal level that it was such a secure vote, because not only did we not see the interference, the foreign interference with the election systems, but we could go back and we had the receipts, so the state could go back and conduct those audits.
Right. And I think that point of how technology is used is so critical here. With that, I'd like to zoom out to one of CISA's core responses to the disinformation side of this, back to that kind of perception concept, and specifically into rumor control. Rumor control is something that we cite a lot in the EIP report. That was really helpful to our work as we were wading through kind of a barrage of incidents on election day and after. How did you think about rumor control? What was novel or special about it? Could you give just a brief overview of what it was, and how you see this as a core facet of disinformation response?
So rumor control, I was in the last administration for about 3.5 years. Didn't quite make it to a full 4. But of all the things we did, rumor control's absolutely in my top 2 or 3 activities. Renaming, getting the agency in its standalone operational posture, as well as a name that tells you what. That was number 1, I think. Rumor control, and just the general Protect 2020 effort was number 2 and number 3, respectively. What happened was we actually stole the idea. I don't know if Matt Masterson may agree or disagree with that, but FEMA had previously used an FAQ model for hurricanes or other natural disasters, where they would debunk, not disinfo necessarily, but misinfo, right? It was the rumor mill. So they provided factual information to counter some of the rumors that were popping up. And that then transformed during the early days of COVID, when you remember the text message that were flying around about how the National Guard was going to declare martial law and all this other stuff. And then you think about 5G and how in the UK, the 5G towers were vandalized because the rumors were that 5G towers were spreading the coronavirus. So we took that model and we saw some of these themes emerging about disinfo or about the election security aspects. And so we wanted to take those, the disinfo, we wanted to deconstruct it and get down to the points where ultimately the logic of the disinfo failed. And then we put facts out around the various themes. The trick here, though, was we could preload the site, Rumor Control site, and I think we launched it on October 21st, or it was that week of the purported Proud Boys emails that were threatening voters down in Florida. But the idea was, you wanted to hit before the disinfo got mainstream, or at least broad enough, but you didn't want to engage it if it was kind of in the fever swamp, because it would put additional attention on it. So it really was a balance. I'm a firm believer in sunshine's the best disinfectant. You have to kill these things really aggressively before they hit mainstream news platforms. And so that was always the challenge. And then as we worked through the end of October to November and more disinfo was flowing, it then became a really overwhelming task of which claims do we think are the most disruptive and the most caustic and corrosive to confidence in the electoral process. And the great news was we had a team that was working 24/7. And in a lot of cases, we had we had rumor control entries up within hours of becoming aware of the various disinfo theme.
Right. And I think that we saw rumor control as a huge one, especially in the early days with the Iranian example you brought up. That was clearly a lot of agencies moving with public-private briefings against what ended up being more foreign angled incident. I do want to ask though, after kind of the initial days of rumor control, moving into November 3rd, which we actually found was a little bit quieter than what we thought. There was a period after that that was really, really key. And then, since then we know that the January 6th incident happened. So I wanna ask you, was there a specific moment where you used the term overwhelming, right? Was there a specific moment or specific story or specific incident that got you to this point of, okay, rumor control might not be enough. Something like January 6th is a possibility.
Yeah, rumor control was not enough. That there's no question about that. I think when the Hammer scorecard rumors about a CIA supercomputer and program that was flipping votes in various machines at the direction of zombie dictator Hugo Chavez, that when it was still in the kind of the Twitter sphere and non-mainstream personalities were spitting that out, it was still manageable. But as soon as those claims hopped onto broadcast TV, network TV, and we started seeing elected officials, public officials, including the candidate Trump himself, start to repeat some of these, that's at that point, little old us down in CISA was not equipped, was not positioned. Just it was the asymmetry of it all. I think I personally had in my CISA account at the time about 10,000 followers, and I could do my tweets promoting various rumor control entries and shooting down Hammer scorecard. I could go do a hit on some TV program, news program. It wasn't enough to eat away, and that was ultimately, I think, where we lost the advantage from rumor control.
Right. And that concept of the asymmetry of the situation, top-down disinformation, is actually really core to the EIP report. So I'm excited for the researchers to shed a bit more light on that in just a bit. Um, uh, I'd like to move a little bit towards kind of solutions here and understanding that we now have a new administration. What would you say are your top 3 recommendations, knowing what you know now, for the new administration to start preparing us for 2022, 2024, and future elections and building resilience starting today?
I think one of the things that I always was kind of pining for over the last 4 years was a more strategic approach to countering disinformation. I think there were a number of activities that we've heard about and others that we haven't heard about. There were much more tactical and operational in terms of countering disinformation, particularly if you think about disinfo as a supply and demand problem. And the supply is getting out there and disrupting the flow of Russian, whether it's Internet Research Agency or other parties, pushing disinfo. That was highly successful, I think, to the point where adversaries had to change tactics, move things offshore to proxy actors. So keep the pressure up there. And then on the demand side, in part, what we were trying to do through things like the war on pineapple was educate in a non-controversial way the American public on how disinfo operations work. I think those, we need to invest more in that. But the top 3 recommendations that I would provide first is you have to put somebody in charge of this from a strategic perspective. You need to have someone, whether it's in the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council, wherever. So there needs to be a counter disinfo czar. And I know that everybody's tired of too many czars, but this is really a cross-agency, cross-platform issue, and at least someone that's just senior enough to pull together the players. And so that's point 1. Point 2 is we need to work to define the roles and responsibilities across government, across industry, across academia and civil society. What are the levers available to each of them? And then where are the gaps and how do we plug those gaps? And in part, that's what I'm trying to do with the Aspen Commission on Information Disorder that we're going to be launching here shortly, of tackling some of those problems in a sprint, a 6-month sprint that we can then hand off to whatever civil society players are willing to act. And then third and finally, rumor control as a service. Disinfo, info operations in general, it's part of the bag of tricks of an expanding number of state and non-state actors. Not only will we see disinfo targeting from Russia and from China, it's going to expand, and we have to stay ahead of it. But we're also, I think, going to see disinfo used as part of the functional disruption toolkit in the corporate conflict space. So 3-4 years from now, every corporate executive, every CEO needs to be thinking about how they fit in strategically and how they could be played off within a state actor or non-state actor conflict.
Right. I really like that. Rumor control as a service. I think that's an interesting idea there. What to move forward, I think, from your recommendations, though, one thing I've been thinking about is how do we know that we're there? What's the clear goal here? What are the metrics towards that goal? Is there ever going to be zero disinformation, or how do we learn to live with disinformation? So in your ideal state, how do we know that we're a little bit closer than we were moving into 2020?
Winning in this space is hard to define. Metrics don't really exist. And the fact of the matter is that the Russians, for instance, prior to the Soviet Union, were already masters at this game. If intelligence was the second oldest profession on earth, I think disinfo spreaders was probably the third profession. And we have seen this just be a toolkit or a tool in the toolkit for decades now in terms of geopolitical conflict. So we just need to be better prepared. There will not be overnight wins, I don't think. I think we can strategize better, we can organize better, but fundamentally this is not about a silver bullet or a single solution. We have to think more about what the next generation looks like. And so we're going to have to invest, particularly on the saving democracy front. We're going to have to continue to invest in increasing digital literacy. We're going to have to continue investing in civics education. And to me, this is like a perfect opportunity from my childhood to come back. And I've talked about this before. But Schoolhouse rocks. It's just a great tool for engaging younger generations on how democracy works. We just have underinvested in sharing about how this experiment that we call the United States of America all came together and how it needs to sustain itself going forward.
Absolutely. We love a good Schoolhouse rock moment. Thank you so much, Chris, for diving into all those with me. I think at this point, we're going to start shifting into the report part of the webinar, and our researchers are going to dive right into the findings. Before we do go to that section, though, what are you most excited to hear about today, and what do you hope people take from the report and the work that researchers have been doing in this space?
So this report, 280 some odd pages, it has to be the seminal report on what happened in 2020, not just the election, but through January 6th. And I hope that it can serve as a launching pad for that authoritative, centralized repository of facts, the truth about 2020. You turn on the news every single night and somebody's up there pushing some aspect of the big lie. And really, even when you hear phrases like election irregularities, that's just a dog whistle for the big lie. So we need something that we can all circle around, we can all coalesce around. And I think this report is just a masterful piece of work that can help defenders of democracy like us ensure that those that will subvert democracy don't get away with it.
Right. I mean, I completely agree. We're really, really excited to bring this report. We're thrilled to present it now. So thank you, Chris, for giving us that context, giving us that send off. And with that, passing it off to Alex to get right into it. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks, Bella.
Thanks, Isabella. Thanks, Chris, for that conversation. My name is Alex Stamos. I'm the director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, and I'm really happy to be moderating the next part of our discussion, which is a deep dive into the report that has been published, and the ability for us to answer some questions that you might have about it. So this is a great time to go download the report. The link is in the chat. I'm sure it'll be posted again. Just a quick 283-page read, so you should be able to skim through that real fast and have questions for our speakers. So you're going to hear from a variety of folks from the 4 different institutions that worked on the election integrity partnership. And what we're going to try to do is hit some of kind of the top line information and takeaways that we wanted you to get from the report first. So first, you're going to hear about how specific incidents of disinformation coalesced into narratives, which then became conspiracy theories, which then became conventional wisdom among some people. You're going to hear about the bottom up and the top down dynamics of disinformation as we saw in the 2020 election. You're going to hear about the repeat offenders, the super spreaders that were the really, really key to creating the disinformation issues that we saw in 2020. A big question we get a lot is, what was the foreign presence like in 2020? Was it equivalent to 2016? You're going to hear in detail of what kind of foreign presence there was and what impact it might have had. And then you're going to hear about the different policies of the platforms, how they changed during the time that the EIP was operating, and what impact that had on propagation. If you have any questions that come up while our speakers go, please put them in the question and answer box, and we'll make sure to get to them. We're going to have a big discussion at the end, and then you'll also hear from a number of other researchers that we weren't able to get to. So to kick us off is going to be my colleague at SIO, our research manager, Renee DiResta.
Hi, thanks so much. So as Alex mentioned, the EIP had, we had teams of analysts looking at false and misleading information. And as we detail in the report, this was narrowly scoped towards voting-related misinformation. So EIP did not spend time looking at every false claim or political back and forth between candidates and pundits. We really focused in on understanding election-related and voting-related misinformation and disinformation. So one of the ways that the voting-specific content manifested in the months leading up to the election was with claims of fraud related to ballots. And much of the way that that happened took the form of isolated incidents. So mail found by the side of a road, some ballot envelopes in a dumpster. These incidents were often posted by ordinary people who happened to observe them. And in the age of social media, that act of posting can push that incident into the public sphere. So these incidents, no matter how small, were then picked up by influencers and by hyperpartisan media, who were then incentivized to slot them into broader narratives. And when we talk about mail in particular, that turned into narratives about rampant mail insecurity, state-level incompetence in the postal service. And oftentimes, the manipulative framing would go a few steps further. Not only were these incidents indicative of massive mail-in ballot issues, the story would go, but these issues were in fact deliberate. The incidents were all connected, and this was all part of a vast plot to steal the election. Within certain online echo chambers, that process of incident to narrative to conspiracy ultimately would then wind up as conventional wisdom, because there would be very little counter content that was seen or observed. And so these framings of these incidents became the dominant perception of what had happened. And even if the incidents were later fact-checked, as they often were, and it was revealed that there were in fact no actual ballots in the mail, it didn't matter, because the narrative had moved on and the outrage machine was focused on something else. So I'm going to pass to Emerson Brooking to discuss a little bit more about how the incident to narrative to conspiracy pathways took shape. And then our colleague Kate Starbird will walk through a case study showing both what happened and how it happened for the notable example of Sharpiegate.
Thanks, Renee. So 2 types of narrative formation contributed to the process that Renee described. In general, we observed a top-down process in which influencers and hyperpartisan media would spin real-world events with the intent of galvanizing outrage. And then we also saw a bottom-up process in which individual tips and social media noise would coalesce into stories that influencers and hyperpartisan media would then spin into conspiracy theories. And these would eventually reach a broader public audience once they begin to attract mainstream media attention. I'm going to take a quick closer look at a top-down example, then over to Kate for a bottom-up. Next slide. So I want to talk about Stop the Steal, a hashtag which we began seeing emerge in quantity in September 2020, and which would eventually be the flag under which the January 6th attack took place. This was an interesting illustration of a top-down narrative formation that appeared to many as organic, The actual phrase, "Stop the Steal," was a slogan created by conservative political strategist Roger Stone back in 2016. And shortly after the EIP began our monitoring program, we began to note that it was appearing sporadically from a few far-right political figures around September, and likewise was receiving numerous mentions from far-right French media, notably the Gateway Pundit. And we had a sense then in our early monitoring that this was sort of a process where seeds were being planted that could be harvested later. Next slide. And indeed, when November the 3rd didn't break the way a lot of Trump supporters wanted, we began to see many prominent far-right influencers basically searching for a way to express their outrage, searching for an avenue through which to distribute their content. And they saw the "Stop the Steal" slogan and hashtag is a kind of bucket where you could collect their cumulative grievances. And then at the same time, others began to see "Stop the Steal" as a vehicle for self-promotion. Newly elected Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene's first major act in the public eye was to circulate a "Stop the Steal" petition, on which she also fundraised and got a lot of money. And at this point, as "Stop the Steal" began to enter mainstream consciousness, we saw regular users taking their cues from these influencers and content creators. The "Stop the Steal" Facebook group was one of the fastest growing in Facebook history. It picked up 320,000 users in the space of 22 hours, saw at least 7,000 posts before Facebook removed it. Next slide. And so as we begin to work our way to January 6th, it was clear that this "Stop the Steal," something that had not begun organically, was now being used as the front for a range of seemingly spontaneous protests. And at the same time, it also become an organization, which was fundraising, which was directing buses of volunteers and demonstrators to different locations. So in the end, "Stop the Steal" was an illustration of a top-down structure that appeared like a spontaneous people's movement. And now over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Emerson. Kate Starbird from the University of Washington. I'm going to talk a little bit, or actually show a little bit about how one prominent narrative took shape online. And this one was around issues that voters were having on election day with Sharpie pens. And they were bleeding through some of the ballots. And this eventually grew into a theory that specifically Trump voters had been disenfranchised by being forced to use Sharpie pens. Next slide. So in most cases, the ballots were designed to be used with Sharpie pens. And so the bleeding through actually wasn't affecting how they were being counted. But that didn't stop the narrative from spreading widely. It began to take off in the early morning of November 4th, so the day after the election, and it continued to spread for a few days and eventually began to feed into the larger "Stop the Steal" narrative movement. But let's take a look more deeply about how this took shape. So you have to kind of remember the context is that Trump supporters had been repeatedly told over the course of many months that the election would be rigged against him and against them. And so they were even asked to sort of look for evidence of that cheating. And so when they went to vote on election day, they began to see that cheating. So initially there was this tone of concern about Sharpie tweets where people saw that they were bleeding through, they were worried that their votes wouldn't count, and they were being directed to bring their own pen. Later, that sort of concern changed to suspicion with tweets like these that were kind of using leading questions to suggest that there was potentially fraud. Eventually, the discourse shifted to explicit accusation that this was an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters, and we began to see more and more tweets like that. So many voters seem to experience this very real sense of disenfranchisement. This example we saw not just once, but many times, is that this voter actually went online to check the status of her vote and found that it had been canceled. This was one of a number of claims we saw like this. But if we actually look more deeply, next slide, the website that she had gone to where she saw that her vote had been canceled was actually giving her the status of her mail-in ballot, which was canceled because she hadn't submitted one. So she's actually misinterpreting this evidence to suggest that her vote hadn't been counted because the Sharpie pens had been used. So this is a person who thought that her side would be cheated, saw the Sharpie pens bleed through, heard that she might have been cheated by some of this chatter that was going online, and then misinterpreted this website as evidence that she'd been cheated. So this was likely a very powerful experience of this person. Not, not something that was external, very internal. She experienced what she thought was disenfranchisement. So if we take a look at, kind of step back and look at how this narrative took shape and spread, this was a graphing technique we used many times. In fact, if you were watching us over the course of the lead up to the election and afterwards, we probably put out dozens of these different graphs. But what this graph allows us to do is kind of see not just like the pace that a narrative takes and how it begins to spread, but the role of certain prominent accounts in spreading it. So what we do with these graphs, the one on top is a cumulative graph. So the y-axis is actually how many tweets have been sent about this particular topic. In this case, it was Sharpie pens. But then we plot each tweet on the graph with the size of its audience, so we can get a sense of like where Twitter accounts with large audiences were helping to push the spread. So if you look early in this kind of propagation, on election day, there were these initial reports of Sharpies bleeding through, but it wasn't really spreading very quickly. And then overnight, at about 2 in the morning, importantly, right after Fox News had called Arizona for candidate Biden, this narrative begins to really take off. And what's happening here is that a few accounts begin to push this out to large audiences, and then it carries over for a course of several days. And if we look closely at who was pushing this content, they were right-wing influencers, including conservative activist Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump's 2 adult sons. And we saw similar patterns like this again and again and again with a lot of these narratives. So if we step back, next slide, please. So if we step back and think about what's happening here, President Trump and his campaign didn't just prime his audience to be receptive to narratives of voter fraud. They inspired them to produce these narratives themselves and then echoed those false claims back to them. This is a very powerful dynamic and one that may be very resistant to correction. It's both top down and bottom up. The elites set the agenda, they feed the narratives, and then the audiences created the evidence to fit those narratives, helping to find the fittest narratives, the most interesting and politically useful conspiracy theories. And then those elites echoed those back to the audiences, rewarding and motivating them to continue in this kind of collective participation. So I'm going to pass this off now to other members of our team who will talk about, Ian and Andrew will talk about the role of influencers in motivating and spreading these false and misleading narratives.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, I'm University of Washington researcher Andrew Beers, and I'll be presenting this section with my colleague Ian Kennedy, also from the University of Washington. In this section, we cover repeat spreaders, accounts and organizations that were highly shared, multiple incidents of false or misleading content about the 2020 election. These aren't people who hammered on just one conspiracy, and they aren't unknown accounts that spam links all day. The users in this section are popular, skilled social media users that are committed to spreading many different unique pieces of misinformation during the election. We start this section by looking specifically at popular Twitter users that repeatedly spread election misinformation. The table we've posted here shows users who posted in multiple discrete misinformation narratives and whose posts received at least 1,000 retweets each. We also include how many followers these accounts had at the time of data collection and how many times they had been retweeted across all instances of misinformation. We can start by highlighting in green Trump's family members, Trump and his 2 adult sons, who are particularly prolific spreaders of misinformation. In addition to being 3 of the top 8 most frequent spreaders of unique incidents, they had 3 of the top 4 most followers, along with Sean Hannity, and 3 of the top 4 most total retweets, along with Project Veritas founder James O'Keefe. We can then highlight in yellow self-described news sources, such as the Gateway Pundit, Breitbart, Sean Hannity, and Mark Levin. As we'll describe later, the Gateway Pundit was one of the most prolific sources of misinformation across the entire election. Add on to that, in blue, accounts primarily related to the QAnon movement. These accounts were famously removed from Twitter in Twitter's widespread QAnon suspensions in January, but they were highly active during the election. Now, in this next slide, we're going to highlight rows in red that are associated with pro-Trump movements. As you can see, every row is red. All of these repeat spreaders are ideologically pro-Trump. This is an important point, but we want to be clear. People of any ideology can spread misinformation. Our full report documents several instances in which primarily left-leaning users spread misleading stories about the 2020 election. That being said, The great majority of misinformation we collected data on was spread by pro-Trump accounts, and the influential, repeated misinformation spreaders we document here are almost entirely pro-Trump. Our data supports that repeat spreaders were an ideologically asymmetric phenomenon during the 2020 election. All of these pro-Trump repeat spreaders share a similar audience and together form a right-wing misinformation ecosystem. Detailed in our report, we use network visualizations to understand the connections between different accounts discussing the election. In the network pictured here, you will find every repeat spreader from the previous table embedded in the red cluster we have titled Mainstream Right. I'll conclude my part of this section by showing which users in this list were verified by Twitter, 15 of the 21 accounts. Verified accounts were responsible for much of the misinformation shared during the 2020 US election. And after the election, Twitter has since suspended 4 of these accounts, labeled in black. And Twitter has blocked search results from being returned for 5 others, labeled in gray. However, many election repeat spreaders remain active, and some have since spread false stories about the January insurrection and subsequent events.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Ian Kennedy, another researcher at the University of Washington. And in addition to individual accounts spreading misinformation incidents, we tracked which domain names were most often cited on Twitter in those incidents. We only counted domains as involved in an incident if they were cited over 1,000 times. So this gives us a second perspective on disinformation on Twitter during the election. While the repeat spreaders were pro-Trump accounts spreading misinformation, 4 out of the top 20 domains were actually reputable news outlets, mostly used for fact-checking. When we estimate their ideological spread, these repeat fact-checkers were also far more likely to be cited by people on the ideological left compared to the other domains on this list. While the repeat fact-checkers were part of the discussion, the domain analysis confirms the most commonly cited websites in our data were sources of misinformation. The top domain in this analysis is the Gateway Pundit, a pro-Trump self-described news source cited in 46 separate misinformation incidents in the 2020 cycle. Their misinformation was varied, from early mail dumping stories to call-outs to other misinfo generators like Project Veritas, to later essential tips on what you can do to stop the steal. The Gateway Pundit spread misinformation across platforms and across time, exemplifying a cross-platform strategy common to other so-called media outlets we studied. The Gateway Pundit's Twitter account was second in our list of repeat spreaders, sharing 25 incidents. Their YouTube channel and Instagram account were also significant sources of misinformation on those platforms. And while their Facebook posts included misinformation, they were relatively low impact and did not meet our standards for engagement to include in this count. The Gateway Pundit was already spreading misinformation in September 2020, setting up narratives like stories about mail-in voting that were influential throughout the election cycle. While almost every domain in this list was a traditional or self-described news website, YouTube, the video-based social media website, was the third most shared domain, involved with 21 of the misinfo incidents we studied. Our report examines the YouTube channel cited in more detail and finds further evidence for cross-platform strategies from other repeat spreaders, like Project Veritas shown here. Considering misinformation from the perspective of these repeat spreaders leads us to 4 key conclusions. First, repeat spreaders were often verified accounts from politicians, media outlets, and influencers. Second, these repeat spreaders were an asymmetric pro-Trump phenomenon. Third, these spreaders shared contents on multiple platforms, all the way from September, even before September, to December. And finally, there were some news outlets who were repeat fact-checkers intervening in many incidents, which might complicate some of the discussion online there. I'm now going to pass it over to Camille, who's going to talk about the role of foreign actors.
Thanks, Ian. My name is Camille François. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Graphica. And I'm going to tell you about the role of foreign actors in this election. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by reiterating what we wrote in the report, which is most of the disruptions to the electoral process came from domestic actors. Foreign attempts to cause chaos in this election were largely unsuccessful and were absolutely dwarfed by the volume of domestic mis and disinformation. So with this framing note out of the way, we have counted between December 2019 and the end of the election season, at least 12 distinct foreign information operations that were focused on the election and or the process and the candidates. These were detected, attributed, and exposed either by platforms, government entities, or researchers. Together, they originated in Russia, China, and Iran. They amplified domestic narratives. They focused on divisive stories and on conspiracies. They talked about hate groups and about violence related to the election. For us, this is yet another reminder that the domestic vulnerabilities of our online conversations and of our media ecosystems are routinely exploited by foreign actors. Now let's talk about the tactics that we have seen in these operations. While these operations were largely unsuccessful, some of these tactics were novel. So first, all of these operations actually spread across multiple platforms, and they usually went beyond the traditional social media networks. Some of them leveraged recruiting sites, for instance, and others created accounts on alternative social media platforms like Gab and Parler. In the case of one of the Russian operations we're going to talk about shortly, these accounts on these alternative platforms were what kept their operation going throughout the election week after their rest of their accounts on mainstream platforms had been disrupted by these mainstream platforms. During the height of the election season, we saw foreign actors impersonate US-based hate groups to intimidate voters. We saw them use AI-generated profile pictures to populate fake accounts, which is a technique that is becoming increasingly popular in information operations across all actors. We saw them enlisting unwitting US-based freelancers to produce and disseminate content targeting both sides of the political spectrum. Another feature here in terms of tactics that was notable is these operations used of websites alongside social media accounts to create a further persistence for these operations after they are exposed and mitigated. As Alex said in his intro, we often get asked how the situation compares with 2016. And it's difficult to answer really because of the huge differences in our collective understanding and preparedness in the face of foreign information operations between both cycles, with 2018, of course, in the middle. Overall, the state of play regarding foreign actors' engagement with electoral disinformation looked very different and much better in this election. Multiple groups across the private and public sectors engaged to expose and mitigate these operations, which, as we said, came from a wider variety of foreign entities. Attribution and mitigation happened publicly and very swiftly throughout the election cycle, with a record public attribution on the Iranian Proud Boys campaign, in which we see less than 72 hours between the first time the campaign is initially caught and analyzed and the public attribution of this campaign to Iran by the US government. I think it's also worth noting that foreign efforts to influence the US political debate using disinformation began well ahead of the election. The first one we saw, again, was uncovered in December 2019, but of course started before that. And unfortunately, they have also continued since. Notably, the events of January 6th at the Capitol have been leveraged by multiple foreign actors in their messaging, both on overt channels, such as state-funded media, and in information operations using fake accounts, notably in the case of a Chinese network and a Russian operation. We can move to the final slide, which covers the set of operations that happened at the height of the electoral season, both originating from Russia, from Iran, and from China. It covers the aggressive operations, notably conducted by Iran to foster online harassment and instill fear in voters, which I think is, again, an important reminder of the links that can exist between coordinated online harassment and information operations. I will let you read through these various highlights. The detail of it, of course, is in our report, but a key takeaway here for us is that foreign actors absolutely took note of the most divisive and violent elements of the online domestic conversation and made these the focus of their ultimately unsuccessful attempts to disrupt the electoral process. With this, I will pass it on to my colleague Kali, who will talk about the work that she led, tracking the myriads of applicable policies and their changes across social media platforms.
Thanks so much, Cam. Hi, everyone. My name is Carly Miller, and I am with the Stanford Internet Observatory. So I, along with Shelby Perkins from Stanford and Nicole Buckley from the University of Washington, led the policy research and analysis for the EIP. So today I'm going to be focusing on 4 key takeaways of our work. However, I want to hit home that underlying each of these takeaways is the notion that policies shape propagation, meaning that the tactics and narratives discussed in our report and also throughout this webinar would not be possible without the unblocked avenues that policies afforded them. So ultimately, we found that platform intervention and users' responses are part of a wider feedback loop. Platforms observe users' behaviors and actions, which reveals a need for more policies or policy changes, and then those policies impact subsequent actions. Next slide. Oh, actually, stay here. Thank you. The 4 takeaways I will touch on center around a comparative analysis of the platform policies leading into the election, the different vehicles through which those policies are enforced, challenges that may not have clear policy solutions, and last, areas where platforms can improve policies moving forward. Next slide. So one of the first research objectives for the partnership was to understand the policy landscape in which election myths and disinformation will be propagated through. As a collective partnership, we established the scope of our work, which became what we saw as the 4 main categories of election integrity. So procedural interference, attacking time, place, and manner, participation interference, discouraging someone from wanting to vote, fraud, encouraging someone to participate illegally, or delegitimizing the election results or casting overall doubt in election integrity. This framework also served a dual purpose, and that was to evaluate the election-related policies to understand where platforms had key gaps. So our team evaluated 15 platforms. Now, at the onset of EIP in August, when we first began our research, many of the platforms did not have comprehensive election-related policies. Over the course of the election, we did see that these policies iterated and became more clear in terms of the content that they would address, how they would address them, and also respond to real-world events such as heightened fear that there would be violence or interference at the polls. However, not all policies adapted or iterated their policies, nor did so in a timely manner. For example, in December, YouTube said it would address claims of widespread voter fraud. However, the seeds of doubt on the election were already planted much earlier. Last, platforms that we evaluated some other platforms that we evaluated, namely Parler, Gab, Discord, WhatsApp, Reddit, and Twitch, remained without election-related policies throughout our researching. Next slide. The second and third takeaways have to do more with how these policies are applied in practice and how actors respond to these enforcements. Generally, platform content moderation strategies fall into 3 categories: removing the content, reducing its distribution, or informing users of a wider context or how that content may be harmful. We have a lot of analysis about each of these different interventions, but for time purposes, I'm going to focus on the content moderation strategies, or rather lack thereof, around repeat spreaders. So as Kate and our colleagues at UW demonstrated, a handful of prominent accounts play a key role in the top-down and bottom-up dynamics of disinformation. However, the policies around repeat spreaders have important gaps. For example, it's unclear how public interest exceptions, which apply to politicians, may play into repeat spreaders. A good example of this dynamic were the tweets from newly elected Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, according to CNN, after the polls closed on election day, over half of Congresswoman Greene's tweets had been labeled by Twitter as potentially misleading. This is an example of how consequences for violating Twitter's policies weren't enough to deter Congresswoman Greene Now, Twitter has updated its policies to address repeat spreaders. However, we're still waiting for other platforms to provide more clarity. Yes. So, however, even if all the policies are in place and if they are consistently applied, it is important to recognize that there are roadblocks and nuances to fully mitigating against mis and disinformation through platform action alone. Obviously, there are other dynamics at play, such as the demand to believe that Trump really didn't lose an election, that don't have easy policy solutions. A good example of this is hard to verify content. So a friend of a friend goes online and posts experience about voting, having a terrible experience, and that post goes viral. So actors like the Gateway Pundit and Project Veritas took advantage of these loopholes where platforms can't go hunt down every unique voting experience in a small town to then take these claims and bundle them up and amplify them to sow doubt in the overall election integrity. Next slide. So looking forward, there are a number of substantive changes platforms can do to strengthen their policies. Ultimately, I'd like to highlight that it took a lot of work to get an accurate snapshot of the entire policy landscape, hunting down every blog post that had a policy in it, so which I don't believe the average user has the bandwidth for, nor do I think we should expect this from an average user. At the end of the report, we do provide recommendations to address policy accessibility, transparency, cross-platform communications, and many more things we observed. Therefore, I hope that our policy analysis and the analysis of that of other chapters goes into making these policies stronger and better equipped to tackle the propagation of mis and disinformation. And with that, I will hand it back to Alex.
Thank you so much, Carly, and to everybody else. We're now starting our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for any of the folks who spoke or of anything you've seen in the report, now is your chance. Please put it into the Q&A tab in Zoom. I just want to thank a couple of people. I want to thank Director Krebs for coming in and being part of this. I want to thank the leaders of all of these teams for teaming up during the EIP and working together. I want to especially thank Isabella for being the project manager and for helping pull this whole thing together, along with a lot of other great people like Elena Christ, Renee, and leaders from all of these teams. And I think Kate has some people she wanted to thank too before we go into questions.
Yeah, I would just like to thank our funders. We have some great funding at Knight Foundation and Hewlett Foundation, the Center for Informed Public, and I think Stanford as well has had some support for their operations. And then especially Omidyar Networks and Craig Newmark for their funding that came just at the right time so we could hire people, onboard people that really made this project possible. So just want to give a shout out to them and just a heartfelt thank you. The work wouldn't have been done without you.
Great, thanks, Kate. Okay, great. So we're going to get to some of the questions. So first off, we have an interesting question about statistical disinformation, that there's a number of examples of people having disinformation that sounded really legit because they used lots of math. What was this a difficult problem for us to deal with? So I'm going to go to Joe from the University of Washington. Joe, you mind answering that one?
Yeah, so we saw a lot of the same kind of pattern after the polls closed, basically. Elections produce a ton of data across a giant, area of both kind of space and time with different patterns that emerge. And people would kind of mine this data and these patterns for irregularities or perceived irregularities. And they could run a bunch of different fraud analyses, find some pattern, and then prop it up as definitive evidence of misinformation. One of the more kind of, at least comedic examples was a tweet saying that there was a decreased rate of turnout in some districts of Philadelphia, where it turned out that the idea behind that was that they were areas with dorms that were closed because of COVID. And so there's often these innocuous reasons for patterns, but the mathematical complexity can kind of overwhelm the person that's seeing the information and make it hard for them to decipher and debunk.
Great, thanks, Joe. We have a question about Stop the Steal. So, for the Stop the Steal hashtag, which we talked a little bit about, one, why was it so popular? Why did it endure and get so much play after the election? And second, like, what was the role of extremist groups? So I'm going to ask Alyssa to answer that question.
Yeah, so Stop the Steal is really an all-encompassing phrase. It really, every election conspiracy, from the election was rigged to ballots in Michigan aren't being counted to Sharpiegate to all these different vague and very specific false claims were sort of rolled into this like one unifying message. So that was one reason that it was really enduring. And then secondly, it was promoted across social media, not only by laymen, but also by a lot of influencers, a lot of different groups, and even by President Trump himself on Twitter. And then as for the extremist aspect, so Stop the Steal protest events occurred throughout November, December, etc. And so some of these, it ultimately culminated in January 6th. There were many Stop the Steal organizers involved in organizing that, but also events like the Million MAGA March in November of 14th. So extremist groups were absolutely a part not only of attending these protest events, but also heavily promoting and organizing for them. So these are hateful, far-right and white supremacist groups, including Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, and various militias from across the country.
Thanks for that, Alyssa. Oh, and by the way, I'm just going to remind everybody, if it's your first time speaking, just make sure to introduce yourself. So Alyssa's from DFR Lab. Question on Dominion. So, one of the most referenced things in our report is these theories about Dominion voting systems, as Director Krebs said, including a zombie Hugo Chavez being involved. Kyle, do you mind talking a little bit about why the Dominion conspiracy theories were so popular?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kyle from Graphica. So as has become pretty well known, the Dominion voting systems narrative was a conspiracy about voting systems using Dominion software being used to flip votes. It actually did start because of legitimate glitches with the software in 2 counties in Georgia, and it was quickly covered by local news. But then it was picked up by various right-wing influencers, blue check influencers, as well as alternative media sources that were discussed earlier, and gained momentum and quickly got all the way to Fox News, of course, and the Trump family. And then eventually was sort of adopted by other groups. So we think of like extremist groups like the Proud Boys, various militia groups, adherents of the QAnon movement, and of course, just general Trump supporters. But as to why it was able to stay around for so long, and it's something we're still hearing about, it's still in the news cycle, we think there's 3 reasons. The first being just generally people are suspicious of software. So they're sort of already primed to not trust things that are confusing and technical. And so there's this big vulnerability among a large percentage of the population for software-driven narratives. The second thing is also software narratives just tend to scale really well. So we think about a lot of the incidents we saw at EIP, we were looking at like, a postal worker was throwing out ballots, and you could isolate these independent instances, but that is very hard to explain why a whole election was stolen. Whereas a software narrative, you could say, well, everybody voted, everybody's vote had to be counted, there was software involved at every step of the process, therefore it can easily be expanded to the whole election. And then finally, it was a flexible narrative, and that's something we often see with conspiracy narratives, that over time they get less and less specific and more flexible. And that certainly happened with Dominion, where it became less and less nuanced and specific over time, and then became a key pillar of the Stop the Steal movement and January 6th events, as Alyssa mentioned.
Thanks, Kyle. We have a question about policy. As Carly talked about, there was a lot of changes in policies in the run to the election. By election day, a lot of the major platforms had election-related policy, but a core issue is implementation. So Nicole, do you mind talking a little bit about how we saw these policies being implemented and what you think are going to be the challenges for the platforms going forward there?
Of course. Thank you so much for the introduction, Alex. My name is Nicole Buckley, and I'm a researcher affiliated with the Center for an Informed Public. So as Carly discussed, the major social media platforms realized the risk of election misinformation, and they adjusted their policies to prevent its proliferation in 3 ways. And although there are significant issues across all three, I'm choosing to focus on removal and contextualization. So intervention in the form of a removal or suspension, when it's done inconsistently, which we saw often, runs a risk of encouraging backlash from conspiratorial communities. And extremist groups tend to believe that removal is evidence of a greater agenda to downplay the alleged truth value of misinformation platforms seek to eradicate. So platforms must be more thorough and precise in delivering removal as a consequence if they're to avoid potentially contributing to the spread of misinformation they're trying to downplay. On the other hand, contextualization, which we saw quite often take shape as content labels, is also particularly challenging. So platforms have struggled to implement labels in a way that's consistent, unvaried, and uniform across subsidiaries. And two, it's additionally unclear just how effective labels are at changing users' behavior and belief in false narratives, because the result of labeling initiatives broadly have not been adequately revealed to researchers. So in some, platforms are facing an uphill battle in making implementation as clear and transparent as possible, but we're hoping coalitions just like this one can make the process a bit easier going forward. Thanks for your time.
Great. Okay, so some more questions. I have two questions that are kind of related. One was there's a specific question about Kate's graph of what's that called and what was used to generate it. And then there's a general question about what kind of tools we use. So I'll have Kate answer the graph and about UW, and then I'm gonna have somebody from each team talk about the tooling they use.
Yeah, the graphing technique, we're calling it a cumulative retweet graph, but we've been trying for years to figure out how to visualize sort of the attention dynamics, to not just see how things are traveling, but like which accounts are causing information to go viral. And that's one of the graphing techniques we've been playing with, co-developed with Emma Spiro and Caitlin Zhu, a researcher with us for a while, who's now on at Stanford. Yeah, a lot of in-house tools, a lot of just like experimentation. Often we're recoding things as we're looking at new data, and just building on a methodological and technical toolkit that we've been working on for years and continue to expand out. And now we're really well supported with the Center for Informed Public, with data engineers and others, and hoping to also get this code out so other folks can use these same kinds of tools in their own work.
Graham, you want to talk about tooling a DFR or Emerson?
Yeah, I mean, the basic answer is that there is no tool that is a easy button that catches all disinformation across all platforms. And so we use a lot of tools that look at individual platforms, and then we reference those results against other tools. And some of those tools are free and open to everybody, and some of them are the same tools that like large companies buy to figure out whether their advertisements for soap works or not, right? And so we use a bunch of tools, and then we compare as many of them against each other as humanly possible in order to make sure that we're not getting any false positives or that we're thorough.
Great. Camille?
Yeah, same on our end. We're using the tools that our colleagues are using, and we are also using our own tooling at Graphica to do large-scale detailed maps of online conversations for analysis.
Great. And from the SIO side, so we have API integrations with Facebook via CrowdTangle, with Twitter via their APIs. We've built a number of things to look at kind of less official social media networks. A key tool for the EIP overall is that we built our collaboration on Jira, which is a very popular task management tool. Atlassian provided that to us under their nonprofit program, and we appreciate the help that they provided us there. And so a lot of work went into customizing Jira, but a lot of the work we did was also just manual monitoring. The truth is that there's no tooling out there that can hit the breadth of the platforms that we're looking at, especially some of these new platforms. So for example, TikTok, I don't know of any good tool to monitor disinformation on TikTok. And so fortunately though, I work in a place that has a effectively unlimited supply of 18 to 22-year-olds who turn out to be really good at browsing TikTok all day. So one of the things we did there was we hired a bunch of research assistants and specifically tasked them for looking manually for those things, and then they would port what data they could capture over to Jira and do that. Another tool we used was Junkipedia, which is an excellent tool that has been used as a nonprofit, and that we appreciate their collaboration. Kate, did you want to add?
Yeah, just one more addition here. It's such a good question, because when I think back at like these collaborations going forward and how they work, I think it's really good to remember that it's a combination of the technical tools that are being built, but also the expertise, the methodological expertise, the contextual expertise, and the willingness to actually go beyond the tools and actually get our hands into the data and have people looking very closely at the data. I think that's what makes these kinds of things work. And I think there's opportunity for us to keep growing that body of work and sharing that with others. And so we'll have, you know, a larger group of people who can participate in these kinds of efforts.
Yeah, and two more to mention. I think a number of us have integrations with pushshift.io. Jason Bumgarner's done some great work archiving data from Reddit and some of the alternative platforms. And then the Internet Archive was a great partner that we used to archive. So one of the key things we had to do is, as we initially found this disinformation or misinformation, is we'd archive it so we had the ability to write this report. And so now that was really critical for us to have tools that could do that, and the Internet Archive provided the majority of that. So yeah, lots of stuff going on. And if you're interested in this, in chapter 1, we talk a lot about the process and operations, which I think is actually one of the unique things about this partnership, is that we had shifts, we had people working 20 hours a day, we had processes that were put in place to kind of explicitly handle handoffs. And that's the reason why we could have 120 people contribute to this without it being, it was a controlled amount of chaos, not complete chaos, let's say. We have a specific question about the EU. So talking about the success of public-private partnership, what are the thoughts about of industry codes of practice with third-party oversight, which is something that's been discussed in the EU through the practice on disinformation, as well as with the Digital Services Act. Emerson, do you have an opinion on that?
In this case, I don't think I'm the best person. I'd say Alex or Camille.
I'm sorry, I'm going to pitch it to Graham. I'm sorry, Graham, I think has some, and then Camille.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I mean, I think that the main difference here is that this partnership was kind of blessed by all parties, but it started truly independently. And so, you know, where EU Code of Practice and a few of the kind of organizations in the EU have started at the request of government bodies, you know, this collaboration, the EIP, started independently, and then ended up talking a lot to federal, state, and local government officials, election officials, media, and social media platforms. And so I think that's the main difference. How that goes forward, you know, in terms of standards for collaboration, standards for information sharing, a bunch of these other policy questions, that's outstanding. I would be remiss if I didn't point to chapter 7, as well as the executive summary that has a bunch of recommendations on that specifically. But you know, it's going to be a policy conversation going forward.
Great. And Camille, as our resident French woman, do you have an opinion here?
I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things coming out of the EU trying to tackle this topic. But I think here, the thing that everybody agrees on is, for these conversations, we need to have independent third-party researchers being able to monitor what's happening, being able to create the transparency and the accountability. Our structure was able to do that successfully, we hope. You know, we hope that others can take a page from the playbook that we started drafting to continue empowering research communities around the world to act as these partnerships and efforts, again, to do more transparency and accountability in this space.
Great, thank you so much. We have a number of interesting points about that coming out of this, that there's a lot of discussion on policy changes around election integrity. Some might be legit, some might not. Graham, do you mind talking a little bit about some of our policy recommendations and what we think about this focus on integrity and the difference between integrity, election integrity, and kind of voter suppression?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that made this so successful was that we didn't try to look at all things to all people, right? Like, disinformation is a broad topic. It touches on literally everything. And so we were very specific in partnership to scope it on misinformation about the process of the election and the results of the election. What that means for a bunch of policy recommendations is that they're pretty narrowly tailored to the process of the election and the results of the election. And I think that there's two broad themes in the policy recommendations. And the policy recommendations are organized by different categories of actors that are policymakers, kind of regardless of whether they realize they make policy or not. And so we have government, we have media, we have social media platforms, we have civil society, and decisions that they need to make or that they could make with regard to policy. And the two broad kind of themes there are the need for very clear areas of lead and support across this set of issues. So like who is doing what on this set of issues, especially in government. And then overarching transparency and information sharing. So transparency and kind of what it is that you're doing or what it is that you're seeing, and then sharing that information with relevant bodies in order to create more resilience. There's a lot of very, very specific granular policy recommendations within those two broad categories, and we could talk about them for 4 hours. I think that we'll probably see some congressional hearings over the next 2 years that do talk about them for 4 hours, but that's probably not something we have time for today.
Great. Well, we had a question about YouTube and YouTube's role here. You know, we talked a lot about YouTube during our weekly updates. So I think there's two parts of this. There's the policy part and then kind of the implementation part. Carly or Nicole, do you mind talking a little bit kind of what YouTube's evolution was on the policy side and where they ended up? And then maybe Kate, you can talk a little bit about what engagement was there.
Sure, I can start a little bit with the policy and kick it off to Nicole. So I think that one thing sort of to frame this answer is all the platforms operate differently in terms of their audience and the medium of content that they share. So just caveating with that, but YouTube is one of the largest platforms that we studied, and similarly to Facebook and Twitter, have been very established in this space for a long time. So one thing that I will highlight is that YouTube, when we did see platforms update their policies to respond to recommendations such as addressing unfounded claims of delegitimizing the election, or who labeling that the election hasn't been called by so premature claims of victory by candidates. We saw that many of the platforms that did have election-related policies implemented these and implemented them early on. YouTube did not do this, and they were sort of lagging in terms of their implementation, which I think we touch on and how that played out in practice, and how things were able to propagate on the platform because of that. Nicole, if I've missed anything.
Yeah, I don't think that you missed anything at all, and I would just take care to note as well that YouTube struggled over time as well with its labeling in general. That's something that isn't unique to YouTube as a platform. All platforms struggle with labeling, but in particular, YouTube had issues with adapting to embedding labels in new forms of issue or content sharing. So we look in the future to see perhaps additional evolution in labeling live content, for instance, and other forms of media as they're introduced.
Kate, did you want to add something?
YouTube, from our view, played a diverse role in the ways that it allowed mis and disinformation about the election to flow. We can't study YouTube as systematically as we can through other platforms, but even just looking at our Twitter data, YouTube is a primary spreader of mis and disinformation within the Twitter data. So we can only imagine what's happening there from a systematic point of view. But we saw them, we would see videos and didn't just have one claim, but they would string together a bunch of different claims, and then they would show up again and again in other places. And then even as other places may be trying to shut down content or shut down false narratives from flowing, they would come up again because people could cite them again at a different time in a different way, and cite those same videos where YouTube is hosting them. And it was kind of a place for disinformation to hide and then be sort of mobilized again later and remobilized. It becomes a resource for these disinformation campaigns. So from our view, it was just really a core piece of the repeat spreading phenomenon and a huge piece of the cross-platform disinformation spread.
And Joe, did you have something to add to that quickly?
Yeah, just kind of reiterating some of what Kate said. We saw a lot of link shortening too with links to videos. And so even if Twitter did its best to delete, say, a video of misinformation or several narratives, it could hide behind these links on YouTube and then just get shared again. So it created a bit of a loophole for misinformation across all platforms.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I think it's safe to say that live video is going to be a huge challenge for all of us from a research perspective. We have a bunch of questions on kind of the same topic, which is effectively, how do you handle disinformation when there is, pushing some of these parts of disinformation is almost an official part of the political platform of one of the major parties. And it's something that you see a lot out of cable news, Fox News, Newsmax, OEN. Kate, do you mind talking about kind of the network effect issues here?
Let me approach this from a couple of different ways. From the data side, it's undeniable that Fox News pundits were among our repeat spreaders. If you look further down our list, we show in the top 25, you look further down the list, there are other pundits in there. And certainly, even though they may not have always been exactly sharing the content as they think it's true, they were platforming these ideas over and over again. And that's just their social media content. We're not even looking what happens when they move it over to their cable news programs, where it's a little bit harder for us to see and measure. So certainly they're playing a multidimensional role, both of like setting these narratives and help, in priming their audience, as we talked about in the slides, priming their audiences to be receptive to these kinds of narratives, but also they serve this role of like, things will bubble up from social media and then they will get platformed on the cable news show. So again, really a clear part of this disinformation ecosystem. And it is difficult, and it's not just Fox News. There are other outlets that are hyper-partisan outlets doing that, but I think that it's going to be hard to address the problem just with social media policies when we're seeing cable news and other kinds of outlets have a role that's just harder for us to measure, but probably just as substantial.
Emerson, do you have something you want to add there?
Sure. Well, first, when we talked about the different content dynamics, the top-down and bottom-up kind of narrative structures, it was fascinating with the EIP to watch again and again with these sorts of bottom-up, where you might have decontextual, or you might have videos or individuals who had particular complaints or concerns. Their concerns would get bundled by far-right influencers, and then these far-right influencers would be doing all they could to try to catch the eye of a Fox News producer. These are kind of concentric circles of amplification and legitimation, which these individuals were trying to reach through. Because if they could get to this Fox News editorial section, then it was very likely they would also grab the attention of President Trump, who was kind of the social media Death Star in this situation. But then also on the broader question of what do you do when one side was so often platforming the sort of voting related misinformation. From our perspective, I think EIP really helped push the envelope with things like just the notion that this delegitimization of electoral processes that we were seeing in the summer and early fall, that this should be against content moderation policies on these platforms, and they began to take proactive steps there. But it was to me a bit disappointing that there was tons of this misinformation that would continue to circulate, because bottom line, these platforms are companies and they had to hedge their bets a little bit. They couldn't outlaw the speech of one competitor in a political process. But after November 3rd, we saw that marked shift where content moderation actions that were we could hardly contemplate a few weeks before began to be taken. There was a much stronger emphasis on cracking down on the sort of content we've been tracking from the beginning.
Awesome, thank you. We have several questions about what we saw in languages other than English. So there's a specific question about Spanish, but we also had some other ones. So I just want to turn to Isabella. Isabella, you mind talking a little bit about first what EIP did around non-English language work? And then second, specifically for the Spanish question, did we see different kinds of disinformation being spread in Spanish specifically?
Absolutely. So on election day, we had specific teams of researchers with specific language skills proactively looking for content in different languages. And that was really core to a section that we now have in the report on non-English language content that we monitored. So I would definitely direct people towards that in chapter 3. To summarize what our findings are there, most of the content that we saw in non-English languages was translated content from the English narratives that we were tracking. So it was coming out after the English narratives. There are some key influencers in these spaces that have hour-long video webcasts, live broadcasts, simply going through Twitter, scrolling through things, clicking Google Translate, and explaining to their audiences what's happening in these repeat offender spaces and rebroadcasting that out. So that, I would say, is the most prominent dynamic that we found. There are certainly some disinformation narratives that were more unique to these spaces, especially given the cultural context that a lot of these communities come in with. But predominantly, it was this translation feature. and something that we will have to continue to take a look at. The last thing that I would say is we did have limited research capacity to go into WhatsApp and some of these encrypted channels, which are prominent within these communities, as well as WeChat for the Chinese language misinformation that we included. So that is the caveat here, and something that we're working on for the next effort.
A big issue. Anybody want to add anything on the end-to-end encrypted or the point-to-point networks of the work that needs to happen there? Okay, great. So we have an interesting question. So it's a very specific question that Kate had tweeted a lot about, which was there was a report from another organization that there's a 73% decline in disinfo on Twitter when Trump was banned. Is that a valid number? Could we attribute to something else? So Kate, if you don't mind addressing that, but also I think there's issues here about people throwing out these numbers in a way that we're a little concerned about. Do you mind talking about that a bit?
Yeah, I think the precision of that number is just impossible, right? So it always kind of triggered a little bit of skepticism on my part for a couple of different reasons. One is, how are they even measuring what's misinformation or not? Clearly they're using keyword terms. Without spending a lot of time, you're going to have a hard time differentiating between corrections and actual misinformation. And so it's all pretty blurry. So just if they had said that we think that there's evidence that there was less misinformation, yes, but the precision of that number, I think, gave me a little bit of a red flag. And then there was a big issue of, like, a lot of other things are changing at the same time. And so attributing it all to the fact that Twitter had done those suspensions, I think, was just a bit of an over attribution. I think that the gist of that is correct, that probably that did impact the spread of mis and disinformation. But in terms of the number, I think that number is wildly speculative and based on some methods that probably are not as precise as the number itself.
Remember, kids, 80% of statistics are made up on the fly, right? Great. And so that's bringing us to the end of the 90 minutes. We had a lot of this. I want to thank everybody again, all of the 120 some people who participated in this, especially the leaders of these teams for all the incredible work they put in. And thank you to everybody who is here and is interested in this and asking all these great questions. Where is this going? Well, all of the institutions represented here, we have now wrapped up the Election Integrity Partnership. That is our final report. We'll be keeping the website up and the content available to folks. All of the groups here are now also collaborating on utilizing what we learned, the techniques that we put together, and the kind of processes we created in a new project that we call the Virality Project. You can go to viralityproject.org to read about it. The website design might look a little familiar. Please excuse us for that. But what we have is a group of institutions, and including some new partners, including some partners at NYU, who are working together to study in the National Conference on Citizenship. And we are working to study COVID vaccine disinformation specifically in the United States, working with public health experts, with officials in the federal government, as well as in state and local public health, and looking to kind of categorize, understand that kind of misinformation and to help those folks prevent it. So if you're interested in that, viralityproject.org, at Virality Project on Twitter. Tomorrow on our website, you will see our first major post, which is a what to expect post, which is laying out the kinds of disinformation that we expect to see around vaccines over the next year. The equivalent post for the 2020 election turned out to be pretty darn good. So I feel confident that that will have some pretty good predictive power. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the team at the Atlantic Council for helping put on and host this webinar. Hope everybody stays safe. Have a great day.